debating death and memory, past and present. It's an archaeodeath debate.
The first point to say is welcome. This is going to be on trans identities in archaeology, and I'm not gonna have a conversation with anyone in this live. This is going to be me talking. It's going to be a lecture style about a topic that is coincides with Trans Visibility Awareness Week in the US. And so I wanted to flag up that, and but I've put the donate button for the organisation that is that promotes that, the GLAD, at the top of the screen. So bear that in mind. We've got a moderated session. I'm very grateful. Usually I use the formidable Spiritual Squirrel Vox to be my moderator for UK Lives, but given the timing and the connections and the US and Canadian audience I have, we have the exceptional Rebel Rabbi who has generously agreed to moderate this live, and so thank you to her for that. And I'm going to be talking for about an hour, and we'll have some Q&As afterwards. And I'm going to also upload an edited version to YouTube, to my Archaeodeath YouTube site, so that anyone who wants to add comments or follow links to some of the resources I'm going to be discussing can do so from there. Okay, so I will be mentioning a series of academic works. This is mainly an academic discussion. I do not have a lived experience of trans identity, but it is essential for understanding the human past, and it's an important and timely subject. And so I am going to be addressing a topic that is very close to people's subject matter. It's very controversial. I hate using the word controversial because it makes it sound like there's something wrong with it, but it's an area where there's a lot of heated debate, and therefore I want to make sure I do so in a responsible and respectful way, aware that I am not speaking in conversation with anyone but about a broader issue, but that I may, as I go along, get phrases wrong or framings wrong, and I'm happy to get feedback and to revise how I articulate these things. So while it's going to be a formal lecture style, I'm gonna sort of try and keep it loose and not fixate too much about terminology. But inevitably, there's going to have to be some discussions of this, of how we use the terms in the study of the past, but past identities. So what's this about? Well, I'm a professor of archaeology. I'm a mortuary archaeologist. I specialise in the archaeology of death, memory and material culture. I have a period interest in early medieval archaeology, particularly the Anglo-Saxons and the Viking Age, but also because I deal with death and burial, I deal with identity, of the identities as perceived in life and constructed for the dead by the survivors, by the mourners, the funerary orchestrators who in past societies made decisions about how the dead should be honoured. And I want to also say that this discussion came about because I was invited by a trans creator on here, Arctic Harmacist, to speak on this topic, and I responded to a couple of their videos, and that led to me thinking I'd go live. So this is a topic I've been long addressing in gender archaeology, but through my teaching and my research, but I haven't spoken on TikTok before. So there's inevitably going to be gaps and things I'll need to clarify and expand upon, but I hope this is a first conversation that we can take forward in thinking about trans identities and archaeology. So the first thing I want to start off with doing is identifying some of the ground rules of our conversation. Why does it matter? Who cares? Archaeology is a very specialist subject. You think, why does that matter to trans gender issues and debates? Well, remember, archaeology is the only subject that can tell us the full story of the human past, the full human journey from previous species of our genus that no longer with us, and the development of Homo sapiens, and the complex story of the different varied places in which societies survived after the last ice age, developed agriculture, developed more complex and hierarchical societies, right the way up to the civilizations of the ancient world, the Middle Ages. The archaeology studies the birth of the modern era, and archaeology also studies our times, the contemporary archaeology of the 20th and 21st century. So archaeology study all periods of the human past and all aspects of the human journey, including our identities and social relationships, including gender and sex. So these are key pivotal themes in archaeology, and I think a lot of people don't even know that. So I think that's an important first point to set out the stall, that this is not only an important subject for archaeology, but archaeology is the only means through the study of material traces that we can access the past lives of the vast majority of the time span of the human story, and the vast majority of people who are not recorded, the minority who are recorded in the dominant discourses of the last few millennia, and who we often frame our historical research around. So archaeology is such an important subject of saying who we are and where we come from, but also it therefore foreshadows where we're going in terms of our development as a human population. So I think that's the first point to say, and that archaeology has long been aware, this is not a new thing to be aware, that we have a responsibility to talk about and research and understand the differences between biologically defined sex, gendered identities and their expressions, and aspects of sexuality, which are still in mainstream culture often conflated, confused, misrepresented and manipulated in our modern society. And the archaeology, therefore, anything that we say about this topic is inherently politicised in some regard, or could be politicised. And that therefore it is not only our sort of opportunity of archaeology to explore gender, sex and sexuality, but it's a responsibility on us to understand its fluidity, its complexity, and particularly how it is historically grounded. That those that make recourse to universal, essential, as in embodied in, trans historical, and not in the trans sense, but in beyond history, saying take things out of history, like, well, the traditional family, the traditional way of doing things. Archaeology has the ability to look beyond our modern rhetorics and modern fantasies about the past, to explore the detailed, fine-grained development, the variability across different societies in how gender relationships and gender expressions manifest themselves, and how that changes over time. And we therefore have a situation where archaeology can expect that through human history there were not only transgender individuals, but societies in which transgendered identities, as part of a broader complex of gender identities, were recognised and incorporated into social structures, and not necessarily in the fashions or any of the ways that we would understand them in the 20th and 21st centuries. And it must be said that this is not a new thing for archaeologists. Archaeologists have been grappling this in conversation with historians and anthropologists and other subjects for around 35 to 40 years, particularly with the rise of post-processual archaeologists, a range of approaches that sort of break down a kind of, well, the simplified view would be sort of the monolithic big man narratives of human history, the big evolutionary social approaches, to try and look at how we can look at past societies in much less monolithic ways, to understand the diversity and complexity of those societies, and to see material culture as expressions of that, actively involved in the creation and recreation of past societies, social relationships, economic systems, religious systems. Okay, so we have to think about how gender archaeology was something I was taught as an integral part of my undergraduate degree as an archaeologist in the 1990s, and it was no new thing then. And there have been extensive, important, pioneering studies of gender archaeology about critiquing how we make bad assumptions today about the past, and how we can explore gender relationships in the past. This is nothing new. And some of the best work actually on this field has been done in the 1980s, 90s and early noughties. But in addition to that, how non-binary identities have been a subject of consideration within that for over those 35 to 40 years. Not necessarily effectively and fully, but it has been a theme, right? And queer theory in particular has had occasional uses and discussions within archaeology of how we can look at the past that decenters a sort of a binary gendered consideration of past societies has been inspirational for many archaeologists. But it must also be said that individuals such as Professor Rosemary Joyce, Meg Conkey, thinking of my Viking Scandinavia or migration period through to Viking Scandinavian work, scholars such as Dr. Ingmarie Bach Danielsen, Professor Elisabeth Arwell Nordblad, these individuals have been writing a lot of really exciting work on this field. So I think we have to remember that there is a long tradition. This is no new thing. And these discussions, while they're framed in ways that perhaps don't sit exactly with the last couple of years, when I see archaeologists suggest, some archaeologists, no one's ever done this, no one's ever worked on this topic, it's important to remember there are sort of now at least 3 or 4 generations of archaeologists who have been trying to explore this theme. But one of the problems we have with gender and sex archaeology discussions is there tends to be, while a lot of material gets discussed, artefacts, art, rock art in particular, figurines, a lot of discussions have been on figurines, representations of the human body. It's always back to burials. It's back to the conscious, often selection of objects, treatments of the dead, placement of those objects with the dead, architectures, spaces. It's often the funerary context where people feel more confident we can discuss gender relationships, and particularly the possibility that transgender individuals were part of past societies. It's to the burial record that people often go. And it's often burials that contravene or seem to break with the traditions that we would expect, but also patterns we find in the archaeological record more broadly in how the dead are treated, that are picked out and for these discussions of potential transgender individuals. And so we have, for example, the Iron Age grave at Vieks, which has been though excavated in the 1930s, has been discussed again and again as an example of a potentially transgender individual, or at least the possibility of this being a transgender individual has been raised as one potential interpretive sort of framework. So in her 2013 paper, Mary Wiesmantel, a paper is called Towards a Transgender Archaeology, a Queer Rampage Through Prehistory. She starts with the Vieks burial and talks about how it's been interpreted in various different ways, as a lady, as a nomad princess, as a transvestite priest, as a rich woman, possibly a chief or tribal leader. These different interpretive frameworks have long been sort of articulated, and calling her an honorary male because of her wealth and status. All of these labels have been loaded and reveal our societies, our biases, with this rich Princess of Vieks Iron Age tomb from France, with a female sex skeleton, but with objects and also deformities to that skeleton that suggest this person may have, and appearances that may have had many male or male gendered associations in that society. So there's a whole host of different possibilities of interpreting that grave and the identity of that rich and exceptional individual. But the problem is these discussions tend to be about exceptions, almost oddities. And I'd use these words deliberately, not to say they were, but I'm saying this is how archaeologists perhaps inadvertently create a freak show, a monstrous moment. And this is what Wiesmantel in her paper says, by seeing graves that transgress the traditional male-female treatment in death are perceived as something odd, unnatural, abnormal, monstrous. I'm not saying that archaeologists have consciously thought this through, but I think it's inevitable if you're dealing with exceptional graves, that those labellings framings come with the territory. And Weismantel says, well, we need, for this burial from the 5th century BC, she says it's too old to call it transgender, which is a newly minted term of the 1990s. Nevertheless, this find and others around the globe demonstrate that many of the behaviours associated with transgender today, and she says, quote, occasional or more frequent cross-dressing, permanent cross-dressing or cross-gendered living, transsexuality, some aspect of intersexuality or homosexuality, and a myriad of specific subcultural expressions of gender atypical behaviours were also part of the ancient life. Now that's the spirit of what we're trying to say and what she's trying to argue in this 2013 paper towards the transgender archaeology. And she says, Weeks is far from an isolated case. The evidence defying binary models of gender and sex is truly global and stretches across the entirety of human history. So that's a really important point. And she makes another important point in this paper. I won't go into the whole of her paper. I'm not going to read it all out to you, but I'm trying to give you a sense of how discussions are developed. And this is from 9 years ago. Interpreting evidence like this from a transgender perspective doesn't mean artificially forcing ancient phenomena into a new and ill-fitting category, she says. If anything, the opposite seems true. It is as if the pre-modern past had to wait for transgender scholarship to arrive, and with it, an understanding that gender is more complex and varied than can be accounted for by the current dominant binary sex-gender ideology of Eurocentric modernity. And there she's quoting Stryker from 2006. Now, forgive me if I'm using very academic language and going a bit fast, but I think it's really important. So what she's always saying is that the past has been waiting for us to catch up with frameworks that understand, that explain this complexity and diversity. Equally, the point, though, is that we've got to be careful that we don't jump into labelling and categorising above everything else, and that's a point I'm going to come back to. So we don't just like early feminist archaeology in the 60s and 70s was desperately trying to look for powerful women to prove, look, women could be powerful too in the past. So the Weeks princess fits that bill too, and fills that role of, look, there were some women had powerful. And you still see popular culture and popular references and discussion still do, of women in the past are still obsessed with this. Let's find powerful women, and that shows that women were on top and women did everything. And it's a bit eye-rollingly cringe and basic, but we don't want to get into the same sort of framework of just let's look for the trans people. It's not just about that. It's about, as I'll come back to these points, it's about a broader reconfiguration of how we even approach the entire topic of gender and sex in the past, and their determinations and relationships between sex and gender. It's not simply about finding the freaks, the weirdos, the abnormal graves, the monstrous graves. Again, not my opinion, just using those terms to think about how perhaps this is inadvertently being framed. If we look for the odd burials only, we don't go, some people go, yes, we found a trans first, and other people, well, that can be misused as, well, there were a few abnormal people, but most people. It's not about that. It's about a rethinking of how we approach gender and sex as part of the human journey of over 3 million years or so, or whatever you want to characterise the evolution of the human species. So, just to recap my points so far, gender and sex as topics of archaeological inquiry are absolutely significant, absolutely essential. And I would say while there are earlier studies, particularly over the last 35 to 40 years, we've seen a gender archaeology. And as part of that, transgender identities have been discussed occasionally within the literature. And I used the 5th century BC Weeks princess as an example of how this identity, the individual's identity in this grave, has been framed in different ways by different scholars who have often missed the mark, don't really know, and haven't really dealt with a theory, and are labelling it as, well, it was a princess, but she obviously had some mannish bits to her identity, or, these kind of lazy, sloppy terms and language. And so we come to this idea of why are we doing this? Why is this topic of transgender and archaeology more important? It's not just about identifying exceptional individuals who may have sat outside the binary in the past. It's about a broader rethinking of how we approach gender and sex in past societies. And it's about making sure we critique, and this is essential, as you could probably guess, critiquing our baggage, our assumptions, or not our baggage, but our societal expectations, which you'd think where we are in the 2020s, we'd have got long past this, but we are still in a world where the default is to assume a binary of identities in which everything else is an aberration. And that we've got to think of the power of queer readings, specifically trans readings of everything from rock art to figurines to settlement debris to ruins, monuments, art, sculpture. I said art before, and to funerary archaeology too. And another key point is that we have to remember, this is all important points that I would go through in a class. I'm not. It's important to say that gender is always intersectional with class, status, age, ethnicity. And that there would have been individuals in the past who sat outside of specific gender groups for a range of reasons, such as they intersect with those other identity categories or identity facets. From the ancient world, we might think of Vestal virgins as maybe being seen as outside of a male-female divide in the Roman world, because maybe, I'm not an expert in Roman archaeology or history, but I'm just saying because of their virginal status, or individuals that have undergone genital mutilation, such as eunuchs, may have been perceived as outside of those binaries. And we have to be constantly aware that this is about critiquing our frameworks, but also our methods and practice of how we do archaeology. We're investigating sites. The very methods we use, and this is a big area of discussion that's happened, which I won't go into, is that the very osteological methods by which we determine male and female, the various, and I talked about this in my TikTok video, the various biases and limitations to those relationships, that we often have dealing with very fragmentary archaeological remains, where many of the traits that would determine whether a person is biologically male or female on the skeleton have various biases inbuilt into them about how they're determined, how we come to those conclusions. And while we can, with some confidence, expert osteologists can sex male and female skeletons, it's always on a spectrum of possibility or probability, from certain to probable, possible, indeterminate. And that doesn't necessarily mean that indeterminate people who were indeterminate in the way they appeared, they presented their gender in the past. It simply means that many people's skeletal remains will not show this this opposition. There's a whole spectrum of morphological features. And certainly when you think about how much your bone growth is modified through your life, depending on your physical activities, certainly in terms of some of our inherent biases in terms of muscle development that we would expect for males and females in our societies are very different from past societies who are doing different work from an early age. And certainly with my very limited osteological analysis as an undergraduate student of early medieval Anglo-Saxon remains, the mastoid processes, the muscular features of some of the female skeletons in this sample I was looking at were way more muscular. And I'm not saying musculature is the primary or only aspect of sex determination. It's not, but I'm just saying, using that as an example, were much more developed than many of the sample and skeletons that we were using, the comparisons we were using for sex determination, which are mainly coming from a different part of the world, from far East Asia. And that's because not only we're dealing with a different ethnic group, a different farming regime, a different labour. These people were working hard from probably an early age, doing much more physical work than we do. So gracility versus robusticity is just one of those areas where sex determination for past populations can be off from ours. And the other point is, while we're now getting DNA work, ancient DNA work, that helps us to sex determine, chromosomal sex needn't equate with biological sex in all its aspects. And that, of course, again, just to reiterate, doesn't equate with gendered identity as constructed by that individual within a social context in the past society. So it's important, I think, to bear in mind that this is about more than just theory. It's about method, about how archaeologists do their work. and come to their determinations. And this is where our biases never leave us, and we've got to constantly reevaluate how we're doing our work. And there's also aspects of transgender identity that are important for understanding the practice of archaeology, of where we do our work, with whom. Are we working with non-Western communities? Are we in dialogue with local communities? Are we in connection with how we report and write our finds? Because a lot of the problems I was talking about come from archaeologists, even very recently, who've been writing about gender identities and either ignoring or misplacing how they refer to transgender interpretations. They're not taking on board. And I think there's an ethical issue here, and particularly when we're dealing with non-Western populations, of transferring or misapplying Western frameworks to an indigenous context, not being in dialogue with those groups. And this is something I'm not doing right now. I'm not in dialogue. I'm talking at you, but it's such an important aspect, and hopefully I can follow up with this and have more dialogue on these issues. I have had dialogue in private, but I've not had dialogue in public about this. But that's important, and how it's ethical about how we treat each other. Because this isn't about trans people past alone. This is about trans people today, and this is about showing mutual respect and showing responsibility. And how we write about the past does have an impact on how people are treated today. And that is, so I can't keep emphasising this enough. Archaeology has the power to tell the depth of the human story from over deep time in a way no other subject does. And with that power comes, as Spider-Man, great responsibility. That then when our work gets used and abused in the public environment, to say, oh, well, trans identities have only been here since the 1960s. There were no trans people in the past. I've heard people say, or equally, to be fair, the other way, or there's always been trans people since the dawn of existence. Well, maybe, but what do you mean by that? What are you getting at by that? Yes, there would have been people who don't sit within a gender binary, but we have to remember that this is not a constant, nor was it an absence. So both can lead us down rhetorical dead ends into modern, and we have to be aware that there's a responsibility in how we write about this. It's not simply about how we write about it in academic terms. It also matters for public archaeology, how heritage sites represent the past, how museums represent the past, how we report, debate and publish it. How do we work with communities, trans communities, or any community which may hypothetically involve people who do not ascribe to a binary, a non-binary or trans identity. I should have used non-binary before, but I'm just bringing that here to say. So and the final point of why this matters as a debate, this is just my introduction, so it's going to waffle on, I'm afraid, is that there are trans archaeologists, of course. There are non-binary archaeologists. And it's really important that their voices within the community of archaeological practitioners across the commercial, governmental, third sector, academic, museum, a range of different ways that archaeology is organised across different nations are part of this process, that they are represented and incorporated into the narratives. And I think that last aspect is the area where I think most work still needs to be done, although work needs to be done across all of these themes. God, this is heavy, I know, and it's a lot of stuff I wanted to pack in here because I want to put this on YouTube, as I said, and I want it to be a fair, reasonable representation of where I see the discussion. Okay, so I know this is heavy, and it's but I you can always rewatch it on YouTube and break it down. Now, what about the actual archaeological record, Howard? How does this actually work in terms of investigating the archaeological record? How do we dig into transgender identities? Well, there are the literature that's out there, I must say, is not ready. It's not ready for a popular. There's been some really good general books that have already done the work of communicating to a broader audience, such as Rosemary Joyce's 2008 book on gender and archaeology, the name of which immediately escapes me, which does this job. But a lot of the work is through case studies, and a lot of the work is still about looking for the unusual, looking for the abnormal. So in my field of study, Anglo-Saxon studies and Viking studies, there's been debates about individuals in early Anglo-Saxon furnished inhumation graves whose osteological sex does not match their gendered grave goods. So this is a society in the 5th and 6th centuries. We're supposed to use the term early medieval England now, but that sucks big time in my opinion. So I still call it about early Anglo-Saxon. Everyone knows what they mean. Early Anglo-Saxon period archaeology, where you have real clear gender divide. There are some graves that are not, they're not just diagnostically gendered, but there's a real clear distinction of gendered objects. Dress accessories, festoons of beads, wrist clasps, girdle hangers, various objects that are female gendered. And then there are graves that are furnished with male gendered objects. And these include particularly weaponry is the most male gendered items. And this can include spears, shields, swords, and sometimes axes, short, single-sided big fighting daggers. They can involve occasional axes and so on. And there are obviously objects that are found in both gendered assemblages. Knives are ubiquitous. And there are individuals who are buried just with a knife, and therefore on those grounds alone we cannot gender them to one of these two categories. But there is a clear gendered binary in the treatment of the dead. Not everyone, but those people that are given a lot of grave goods, they fall into these two categories. But then some of the osteological evaluation of the female gendered assemblages are suggesting their bones suggest they're male. And this is only a few, of the weapon burials seem to be osteologically female. And people try to explain this away and say, well, this is because of errors with osteological sexing, or it's a bias based on the misattribution of grave goods and the misunderstanding of grave goods. So there may be a whole series of issues there. But we still have some individuals that sit outside of this, and people have discussed whether these are individuals who had a third gender within early Anglo-Saxon society. While a term that might be is anachronistic, colonial, and perhaps derogatory, but the term birdash has been used in discussions of these individuals, and at least while that debate is ongoing, there are still a variety of ways in which those individuals could be interpreted, and it does still assume that the individuals being buried with objects that were theirs or to reflect their identity, which may not always be the case. Some of those objects have been explained away by the fact that, for example, spearheads in female graves, female gendered assemblages, in some cases it's because it's not a spearhead, it's not being used as a spearhead anymore, it's being used for another function. So it's in the female gender sphere because that weapon is no longer being used as a weapon. So there are examples of that kind of thing, but there's also a series of burials that still require our attention. And I think we have to at least keep open the possibility that some of those individuals would be today described as transgender. I'm not pinning my arguments completely on this, but I think it's important that we entertain the possibility that even in a society that is clearly patriarchal from all the historical records we have, is clearly dividing its social identities and roles and functions in society very clearly into two camps or two groups, still there are individuals that transgress. Another example that I talked about in a previous TikTok is the recent sort of early medieval or very late Viking age into the early Middle Ages of Finland burial from Suontaka Vesitorninamki. I can't get that right. And this is published in the European Journal of Archaeology, where the ADNA and work has been done on that burial, as well as osteological sexing. And this is an individual with a mixture of female dress accessories, but also weapons placed in the grave, but who may have been someone who had Klinefelter syndrome, and so physically may have exhibited traits that inspired this distinctive funerary treatment. So the authors presented the possibility this was a person who was non-binary in the sense of someone who transgressed the gender divide. or did not identify. But I mean, the problem, of course, with all of these studies is we cannot get inside the minds of past people. We cannot. We have to be wary of the fact that funerary rituals may not reflect the identity of the dead person exactly, and that maybe multiple stories were being played out by the mourners in relation to these individuals' deaths. But this is the archaeological record showing us a more complex and potentially nuanced picture. Okay, so we have that kind of aspect at play. And then we also have the possibility that people's, in particular, roles in society transgress the traditional gender roles. And there's been a lot of discussions of whether ritual specialists in the Viking world, practices of say the magic, whose graves we have seemingly got some exceptional graves that could be the graves of vulvas, a ritual specialists, particularly females, who have a range of exceptional objects, could have been seen as appropriate individuals to bury objects traditionally seen as male gendered, or mixing up male and female gendered objects because of their special ritual role. So this can be seen as a kind of third gender, if you like, because it's someone who sits outside of the traditional range of identities and roles. And then we have examples such as BJ 581, this famous Viking female warrior, a burial found in the late 19th century in the massive cemeteries of the proto-urban trading settlement of Birka in Sweden, a chamber grave with 2 sacrificed horses, a range of weapons. But recent ADNA work has been able to demonstrate this was a osteological and ADNA evidence is able to show this individual was female. And what in a previous TikTok I've pointed out that one of the things I thought was shocking about that interpretation published in 2017 in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, and then with a follow-up article in Antiquity in 2019, was their inability to tackle the possibility this individual could be considered a transgender individual. It has to be a woman who wielded weapons, not potentially something else. And again, like the Veek's princess, we're back to this problem of we think we've got something clever and interesting, and we jump to one interpretation without exploring the range of different, varied, different kinds of potential gendered identity being expressed in this burial ritual. And for me, I think that there's no compelling case that this is a Viking warrior woman, but there is actually a more interesting case given the broader work of Leszek Dewa looking at other female gendered individuals or osteologically sexed individuals who have weapons, that this may be actually a third gendered ritualized role linked to someone being a ritual specialist. But this is all open for debate, but I'm just saying these are areas where burial archaeology has allowed us to think about a more gender complex, fluid, non-binary set of identities that may have existed in early medieval societies. While these individuals may have been rare, we're not saying every second person was transgender, or every 2 in 3 or something ridiculous like that. We're just saying there is space within our archaeological narratives for thinking through these issues, and there's still a reluctance to do so in the archaeological and academic communities. And indeed, in the broader society, it's easier to make it simple and not to talk about the complexity and the possible nuance. Another example, those are early medieval case studies from burial archaeology. Another example I can take you to is the recent analysis of a burial from Harper Road in Southwark, in part of the sort of the suburbs or the southern settlement across the River Thames from Roman Londinium. This is a burial that dates to the 1st century AD. The individual died at the age of between 21 and 38. The Harper Road burial was extended supine, had iron nails, a neck ring, a flagon, bronze mirror, and 2 Samian-ware vessels. And the mixture of osteological and ADNA work on this individual suggests this person may have been, in the 2017 article, has been argued to be intersex or transgender woman. But there are other ways of interpreting that grave. There's different ways of interpreting those objects, because some of those objects could have male associations. Mirrors have only been traditionally seen as female, when actually they can be found in male graves in the late Iron Age. In other words, there's more nuanced ways we can perhaps read these graves, and these burials are still being interpreted using labels and terminology that is a bit dodgy and without clarification. And certainly the media has picked this stuff up and run with stories that perhaps simplify more complex narratives. So she's called white European, indigenous and Roman colonizer, part of this, who experienced this process of colonization. And those terms are fine, but not without qualification. And when they go into the media talking about white European, it would have meant nothing in the Roman world, being white. We know that in our modern discussions that whiteness is very much a postmodern construction from very late medieval roots. But if we're talking about identity terms that apply to individuals in the past, using a word woman, well, if this individual shows a range of different perhaps signals and signatures in the treatment in death, could there be someone who... Could this be, rather than an intersex woman, could this be because some of the, I should have said, some of the chromosomal evidence suggests male, or could this be someone who is transgender or non-binary, rather than someone who defines himself socially as a woman? So there's different ways in which we can read this evidence. And I think another good case study for this is a Czech burial from the corded ware culture, sort of a third millennium BC. And this was a big story because there was some really good pushback from people like Christina Kilgrove and Rosemary Joyce in the media, because this story wasn't even analysed. The other studies I was just showing you, at least, are the results of archaeological analysis. This was a Czech Archaeological Society in the suburbs of Prague, where they found this individual on their left side, and they called them, in 2011, they went straight to the media without any analysis and said this is a homosexual or transsexual individual. And this went viral as a news story. And rightly, as I said, people like Rosemary Joyce, John Hawkes, Christina Kilgrove pushed back as academics and said this is terms that are conflating sex, sexuality, gender, and it's not precise, and the analysis hadn't even been done. And so these kind of stories of potentially identifying aberrant burials are fascinating, don't get me wrong, but they can lead us into some dodgy territory in terms of framing and misrepresenting the evidence. And in an article by Pamela Geller, she really pulls apart this problem of that burial and the way it was treated by the media. And she has some really interesting things to say that I want to just quote to you, because she talks about the danger of presentism, of seeing the past in contemporary terms, and talking about, for example, the number of times in which archaeologists have talked about monogamy in the past when we don't have any really clear evidence and they're not clear about what they mean. She talks about how the lack of care with which this Prague corded ware burial was, lack of care in which it was interpreted in the media as likely he was a man with a different sexual orientation, homosexual, transsexual. That's the quote. And that the headlines then read, the Telegraph said, the first homosexual caveman found. Or the Daily Mail, obviously trying to do a humorous spin off Little Britain, the headline was the oldest gay in the village. 5,000-year-old man is outed, or year-old is outed by the way he was buried. And you can see how this is a cluster of mess, of poor interpretations and misrepresentations. And it's not, what I'm saying is that it's not that we shouldn't talk about these burials, but that they, in the mediascapes, as Geller talks about in her article, these take on a power and an influence, and even the most generous archaeological pushback can't, it's out there now, transsexual caveman, it's sensationalizing is the word I'm looking for. It's sensationalizing. It's creating a freak show out of burials that could be telling us very important stories, and it doesn't take into account. It assumes a heteronormativity. That's Geller's term, and it's well discussed. And these individuals are weird in relation to that heteronormativity. It's not trying to get beyond this normal versus odd treatment of burials. So we've got, and so while some perhaps individuals who identify today as non-binary or trans may look to these individuals and go, yes, we've got some evidence of a deep past origin of the way I experience and it can be positive, it can also be negative because it's setting those past individuals out as weird and different and even monstrous in some way, in the way that they're talked about. And we've got to be very wary. We can't control the media. The media is going to spin stories, but it is a very, there's a broader set of debates, and there's been really rich debates about gender non-conformity and non-binary genders, dealing with not only Iron Age France with the Vix Princess, but also with the ancient Mesoamerican societies. Geller's conclusion is actually quite interesting. She says we should, to demonstrate the socio-sexual diversity that has existed through time and space, bioarchaeologists, which she means bioarchaeology and mortuary archaeologists, could look for those individuals whose identities were defined by a queer status according to our contemporary understanding of the concept. The transsexual caveman, for instance. Presentism would ultimately undergird these efforts, however. I think what she means there is that inevitably those framings are going to be misused and misunderstood in contemporary society, I think. Rather, a far more productive approach is to situate socio-sexual identities and interactions within cultural historical context and to understand the processes at work in their formation and reconstitution. Right, okay, this is academic terms, but what she's trying to say is let's look at the bigger picture, right? Such instances are not anomalous, though. They do require researchers to attend to the ambiguous and identify the idiosyncratic. So what I think she's trying to get at here, and it's a really good paper, right? It's just that it's trying to speak to a broader audience here. It's not always clear what she's saying. I think what she's saying is that rather than trying to identify trans individuals, we should be looking at how our broader frameworks include a spectrum of genders. And she actually talks, the phrase she actually says is we should be looking at gender in a broader sense, rather than simply a transgender archaeology. We should be looking at, as Wiesmantel in 2013 said, we should be looking at transgender archaeology, creating a transgender archaeology. But she says we should be going in a much broader way to looking at gender diversity and gender relations. So gender variance is her phrase. I was just searching for it. Yes. So instead of a transgender archaeology, quoting Geller, I advocated for the investigation of gender variance. I use the term here as a catch-all for identities and actions that depart from the norm, as well as recognise that an individual's gender is incongruent with their biological sex. So gender non-conformity, non-binary gender and gender bending, though perhaps not gender dysphoria for its allusion to the modern clinical and stigma, are equally applicable. Okay, so we're getting into the detail here, but I just want to give you a sense that this is a conversation that's happening across different periods of the archaeological past, from prehistory through the ancient world up to the Middle Ages and to the modern era, in which archaeologists are trying to deal with the problematic misuse of their terms, but also pushing into the past and seeing a range of identities present that don't fit our expectations and norms and patterns. Okay. Whew, this is heavy stuff, I know. So we're 45 minutes in, so I'm going to move on to my final section now. For those of you wondering when it's ever going to end, I'm going to have a sip of my my Irish Slane Irish whiskey. There you are. Product placement. No, they don't. I needed to get some drink. I want to now talk about two final areas moving forward. So what do we do here with burial archaeology? Well, the thing is, there's only so much archaeologists can say. Same with historians. Historians have written accounts, but those written accounts may be literary, they may be exaggerated, they may be distorted, they may be biased. Same with archaeology. We can never reconstruct exactly how people felt in the past and how they identified in the past in massive detail. There's always going to be different alternative interpretations. I think we do need to avoid sensationalising, avoiding fixating on individual graves, decolonising our language while also being accessible in our language. we have to be aware that for many people outside of a Western culture, talking, it can be very appropriative. It can be very colonizing to talk about trans identities applied to ancient people who have descendant communities who may have other terms and framings for those concepts. We have to focus on challenging our heteronormative values and norms, and that's, I think, the key point. And not simply by identifying exceptions, but by thinking about transgenderism as an integral part of gender fluidity and complexity in different societies, to see them in history, not to see them as part of universal. And I think we also need to work on linking this with transgender archaeologists actually voicing their views on this issue. And I wouldn't be speaking today if so many transgender archaeologists hadn't already put in the comments of my previous video that they appreciated me speaking on this. I'm not speaking for them. I'm just saying I've been very reluctant to talk on this issue because I know there are transgender archaeologists. But it's the whole dilemma, isn't it? If you I better set back and I'm not going to talk about this because it's not my place. Well, actually, it seems to be that people want me to enter this conversation. So I think that's one of the most important points I wanted to get across. But there's a final area that I want to get to, and this is really interesting because it comes from the very video and the request for me to interview. Because what was happening was, I hadn't realised the scale of it. I'd seen it, but I hadn't realised the scale of it. Was the very scale of rhetorical use of archaeology to bash trans people. And it's not archaeologists today that are used that way. It's the archaeology of the fictional future. So the argument is, in 500 years, archaeologists will tell whether you're male or female. The rhetoric point is that you are lying, delusional, confused. Future archaeologists with their science will sort it out for you. And what's really ironic is that so many of these commentators are more than happy to knock archaeology, to dismiss archaeology. Archaeology is underfunded. It's denigrated by the right-wing media. We're seen to be, constantly on the back foot from criticism in broader popular culture, until they can use archaeologists to bash trans people. And they're doing it in a way that hits, is very powerful, because it's powerful in a dangerous way, because there is still a popular understanding of archaeology as grave robbing. And I've come across this on this app, that some even well-intentioned people still like to go, oh yeah, you with your British Museum and your rifling people's graves, which is not inaccurate in terms of the history of the subject, but is such a gross mischaracterisation of what archaeology can do and its possibilities of what it can offer for understanding past societies and our society, that it is just utterly crippling and demoralising to see that moronic gut reaction. Oh yeah, you're all colonial. Yeah, well, archaeology is a tool of white supremacy. Yes, it has been, and it is, but that's not all it is. and it's interesting to see the people that would, use archaeology in that way, using it to bash trans people by saying, well, future archaeologists will be getting in your grave. And it's quite disconcerting, and it's really upsetting. And I can see how upsetting that must be to individuals who are trans, as just a mocking rhetoric of, your life is a lie, the future archaeologists will be in your grave, ripping out your grave goods and telling you who you really are from your bones. And of course, it's not only rhetorical nasty, but it's also wrong, because it shows a gross ignorance of everything I literally just said for the last 45 minutes, that archaeology is well engaged with debates on gender and sex and sexuality in the human past, but also shows a complete ignorance of how archaeologists determine biological sex from bones, morphologically, and now with ADNA, and how we work with understanding grave goods and other furnishings and treatments of the body to understand gendered identity in life and death in the human past. So it's shitty, in other words, but it's more than that, because what was really interesting in the comments on that video that I made, duetting Arctic Pharmacist, was the way that many trans people were really challenged by this in different ways. And many people who are trans in the comments, to my mind, seem to want to be seen. They want to be recognised as for who they are. They want their story to be told. And they're almost frustrated by the idea that archaeologists of the future would tell a lie on using their remains against their narrative of who they are. And yet others were quite humorous about it and said, well, who gives? I'll be dead. Who cares what this arsehole thinks in 500 years? And I think that shows a positive, powerful, and other people were saying, the practical point, well, if these fictional archaeologists in 500 years, good luck to them. Most people can't even afford to get an earth burial, an inhumation. We're all going to be cremated. Like, in America, it's a majority cremating nation for the last decade now, or 8-9 years. In Europe, most of northern Western Europe, cremation is anywhere from 60 to 95%. No, 85% cremation. So, good luck to you, future archaeologists. So it was a really interesting, the imagined future archaeologists, though seemingly a grave robbing dick who's basically just, as created in fiction, in this rhetoric, is not a nice person and is just like trying to deny people's personal and lived experience of gender. Actually serves a positive function for many trans people, because it's mocking the fact that, well, who cares about that? I'm living my life. And yet simultaneously some trans people are saying, well, I'd like to be recognised by these imaginary future archaeologists for something I am. And there would be ways in which my identity would be exhibited through my grave goods, through my treatment, my perhaps inscriptions I'd leave behind, perhaps through the fact that my lived skeleton would reflect the fact that I have had various treatments, surgeries or hormone, that would have changed the way my bones look. So in many ways, I'm not saying it's fully positive, but I think there was a lot of hope, a lot of kindness, and a lot of humour in those responses. It showed that while the imaginary future archaeologist is being evoked by some really nasty people to mock trans people, it can be a positive space. The future of archaeology is a space where trans people can sort of discuss and think about their identity. And I haven't really thought through the implications of this, but this is one of the ways where I think TikTok can be a really fun and interesting and constructive place to help us think through these issues, because of course the real archaeology of 500 years time is unlikely to be wasting their time, and this is another point made, wasting their time fixating on the identity of one skeleton, regardless of how well it's preserved, and regardless of whether you can tell whether this person was trans or not. That's not going to be the focus. There's going to be much more bigger questions, like what happened to these people after they destroyed the climate, and all these other things. There's going to be bigger issues. But it does reflect our society's obsession with other people's bodies and identities. The mainstream and particular sections of our society are deeply threatened by the very existence of a relatively small number of people whose life doesn't fit into their idea of norm. And that's where I think archaeology can be a very positive voice on these issues. And I think that's where archaeology, in a real archaeology, can make a difference. I'd like to think. And so while archaeology seems very removed, it's about fusty, dusty old stuff, it really is important for how people think about themselves today. And how we imagine archaeologists of the future can be used for ill, but it can be used in a very constructive way to think through what it means to be human, and what it means to be understanding of variance in gender, identities and relationships in the past, in the present, and in the future. Now, I've talked a lot. I've talked for 55 minutes in a very dense way. I've packed in about 4 or 5 undergraduate lectures that I did in that time. And as I said, I'm going to put this all on YouTube for people to think about what I've said, and I will put in links to resources as well. But I'd now like to talk. I've seen so many comments, I haven't been able to keep up with them. I'm going to take off my Hoovian scarf because I'm overheating, and I'm going to try and go back through and see whether I can identify any questions that I should be responding to. Is that the beginning? Yeah, here we go. I'm just going to take off my old jumper and have another sip of the old sip of the brain, sip of the whiskey. Cheers. And see if I can find any questions of yes, so the term two spirits, as I said, that links into the problems and challenges of us using terms that perhaps should only be reserved for Indigenous communities in a broader context. I think that's a really interesting issue. Yes, I mean, I think people are arguing a lot on social media about these issues, and there are a lot of, we shouldn't, it's about should have these debates, but we can do it in a tolerant way, and I've kind of steered clear of a lot of this because I see it's so sensitive and upsetting to people to see these rhetorics aimed at them, but I think it is. Everything is a hypothesis of identity, and I think that's really important. We're never going to get back. We can't time travel. We're not Time Lords. But we are trying to get at understanding the diversity of human experience. And so that's what we study the past for, to inform our understanding of who we are. Jen says she's going to be buried with her farming implements just to throw off future bigots. I think that's always good. And I think that's a really other positive, and that's not new, actually. I'm not saying the idea, and I've talked about this a lot. What would I do to really piss off my future? I think about this a lot myself. What would I bury to deliberately befuddle future archaeologists? And I saw a video of someone on TikTok creating those ridiculous grave for burying something. I can't remember what they were burying. As if it was something of value when it wasn't. So I found that very amusing. So yes, there's many a future way to confuse future archaeologists. So the question about Viking societies and gender fluidity, I think I've partially answered. Certainly this is a rich area of discussion and debate. I think some people have perhaps, a lot of the literature out there I think already is perhaps in attempts to rectify past mistakes. I think some people are perhaps pushing the evidence further than we have conclusive views on, but I think these are conversations worthy of having. Oh no, this is doing this whole zipping around the discussion. So I was literally in the right place, and then it suddenly, I've jumped about 50 comments. I don't know what I did there. I think it's actually messing me around here. I think I just jumped about 100 comments, so I'm going to have to go back and try to find out what's happening. I'll get back to you in a second. You have to be very careful when you're touching the screen, or it suddenly zooms. As a future trans archaeologist, I very much appreciate discussions of this. Well, that's great. Right, this is the point where I lost it, and it went. Yes, I mean the "we've always been around" comment is. I'm not saying wrong, because I think it is true, but it's also, we as in an identity that fits into our society. Well, no. I mean, as I said, I like the idea of where it was phrased by the way it was phrased, that almost archaeology has been waiting for society to catch up with this fact. I think is very powerful. I think that, way of thinking about it. Gender in Iron Age Britain is a very interesting topic, Carrie. I wish you well with that topic, because I think that is a really interesting area. Iron Age is a bit before me, but you've got some really, really interesting discussions there with various different burial traditions going on: cremation, inhumation, exhumation, and it's about thinking through what, how we discern from those complex burial procedures, how gender was being expressed. because any funeral would have multiple agents involved in it, not just simply the wishes of the dead person, but family members, allies, associates, who attended the funeral. People like my scarf. It's a brilliant scarf. Keeping out the cold. Yeah, some people do find gender archaeology hard to digest because, as core belief is saying here, it's a conflict with today's normative beliefs. But also because rhetorically, some people in our society want to pretend that, early or mid 20th century rhetorical norms as constructed for us now were universal. And this is the universalism I was mentioning. We need to be tackling and critiquing. Fourth Doctor, thank you. Yes, absolutely. Tom Baker. Again, I'd repeat the qualifier that we should really not be using two spirits, outside of indigenous groupings, I think, and particularly North American. How can modern media better understand these complexities? Well, with can I answer this question? Because Vanessa Fiji's really good point. Archaeology has a love affair and a love-hate relationship with the media. We get some of our best new discoveries. We rely on the media to tell good news stories about archaeology, and yet they equally misrepresent so much of what we do. And it happens in terms of race, ethnicity, everything is, and the media are only interested in certain kinds of stories. So if you talk to press office, I have a PhD student, Ellie Chambers, who's actually working on how bioarchaeology can more responsibly communicate with the media over issues of race. And she's looking at how the Daily Mail and BBC News and various other outlets have reported on archaeological discoveries and discussed issues of ethnicity, race, and also she's dealing a bit with gender. And I wait for her recommendations, but I think that we can't control the message, but we can at least try and give out a message that isn't ripe for misuse. And for me, I think I've already been on record and said I thought the BJ 581 story about the Viking female warrior was a massive popularity coup for archaeology in 2017. Viking archaeology hit the headlines around the world through that story. But I also found it was actually quite a problematic and I would say borderline unethical representation of the data. And I think that the very fact that they didn't even mention the possibility of a non-binary identity for that individual was telling. That's my very academic way of saying I think they not only just simply missed a point, but they set that article up for popular consumption without thinking about some of the implications of other scenarios that would explain that grave. So I think, we can't control the message, but we can darn well do our best to make sure the media don't run crazy with silly ideas. And when it happens, we need to stay with the story to make sure that we're putting out blogs or putting out social media that says, no, the Daily Telegraph is saying this. That is not what the archaeological evidence is telling us. I think there is a responsibility there. Thank you, Sophia. I am adorable. Thank you. That's good. Yes, drinking alcohol is an archaeological stereotype. I do fit into the gender stereotypes and my academic stereotypes of drinking whiskey and various things. I'm sure I'd ever. I mean, archaeology is a complex subject. It's a subject with a dark and depressing past. We are part of the colonial regime of rifling other cultures stuff. I'm not denying that. I'm just saying that 21st century archaeology is the one subject that can really, in a positive way, sort of reconsider a lot of these issues. So how can we as archaeologists combat bigotry more, says that auntie? Well, I'd like to think it's not by shouting at people, but by having plain, clear, responsible conversations. That may be me being naive. I think archaeologists are sometimes their own worst enemies in wanting to look on the right side of a subject and shouting about it. And that can actually create more problems than it answers. So I'm very much more for a reasoned, clear conversation that is honest with the public about the limitations of our data. The public are really engaged and have been for a long time with this subject. And I think it's really important we don't patronise the public. We involve them in the discussions of individual graves, of individual artefacts, and then try to think through the various issues with that evidence without, trying to present it. I think the public feel a lot of the time patronised by archaeologists trying to simplify things beyond the need to be simple. And I think for me, the way we do it is by, there is a hunger, there's a thirst for depth of inquiry and depth of understanding. And so while not everyone's going to sit through an hour-long TikTok live, TikTok and other social media platforms do give digestible, short snippets of information, but where we can still follow up with further information. So if someone goes to us, I don't like what you're saying, I don't understand what you're saying. Well, here's a book, here's a blog post, here's something you can follow up. And I wish TikTok was more referenceable, had more citational ability, so that when I put out a little piece of information, people can go back. But the problem is it doesn't do hyperlinks, and that's part of the problem. So I think there is a long way to go, and our technology is part of the problem. But I think we are, we're trying our best to, get the message out there and stay on the media, and to try and, challenge some of the simplification that some of our colleagues put out. Often we're trying to, firefight our own message that we've created. So I think that's one of the things I think we can do to combat misinformation. And again, it's just shifted me right the way to the end of the comments. So I'm having to go all the way back. I don't know what the heck this is doing. But anyway, I'll try. I may have missed other people's questions. So I'm just going to try. There's a lot of comments. Wow, you lot have been busy with your comments. I don't even know. You don't even have a timeline of when you actually posted this stuff. I think this is one of the limitations of a TikTok live. Oh, I found back to the question I just asked about what efforts does a host believe we could do to put in place to balance the sensationalism of the media. Well, I think we have it's that layers of information. Yes, there'll be people that will only look at the headlines, but if people want to learn the detail, there's so much more we can do to provide that detail, I think. And we can't blame the media all the time when we're creating part of the problems. I think that's one of the things I would try to say. I think it's very important we don't blame the media as always responsible. If we can't produce an engaging story of our own, as David S. Anderson, who writes about pseudo-archaeology, part of the problem is we need to do better with the way we communicate. Now I'm in the right place now. Now I know where we are. Okay. It is a Doctor Who scarf. Yes, there's some problems of how we view Indigenous identities, and that's another major area. I'm not an expert in that. I'm just flagging it up. You're a Sheffield student, Carrie. Well done. I was an undergraduate at Sheffield, and we know what's been happening there in the last year, of course. So I'll take another sip of whiskey in your honour. Say hi to Hugh and Umberto and others. Media see themselves as first draft of history. How do we hold them accountable? Well, I mean, it's, as I said, I think we're the same point again. I don't have the answers there, but we can at least try to counter some of the misinformation. I think so few of my colleagues want to be doing this work because we're not paid extra for doing like midnight on a Saturday, discussions. But not only that, we are bashed a lot of the time by the media, and I think a lot of my female colleagues and transgender colleagues can't take it, and I don't blame them. I wouldn't want to be. I went on a radio show in the summer. and talked to an Asian journalist, and the amount of abuse I got afterwards, most of it was aimed at her, but I got it too on race issues. It was just phenomenal, and I can cope with that, but I don't want that like every day of my social media career. And I think that's the problem, is if you are a person who is transgender and you're trying to make your voice heard on these issues, I think you're just going to get all manner of threats and abuse. And I think a lot of people can't cope with that. And that's true of archaeology, that's true of many other disciplines. So a lot of academics just keep their head down, and I don't blame them, because they're doing really great work, but as soon as they release a blog post or a social media post, they get set on by a pack of wolves. Not all the time, but it's happening, it's there as a possibility, and there's no real support for it. And whether it's getting stalkers and threats, so I think there are a whole series of issues there. So I'm thinking through whether I've answered all the questions, or are there any more that I've... if you have him add a poll feature. Yeah, I'll tell you what, I started using the TikTok Studio Live, which I got onto my work computer, and I found that much easier to navigate and be able to add add more conversational features and polls and stuff like that. I think that'll be really good for future lives, yes. But I don't know if I've missed any other questions that I have failed to identify in this rather difficult. But I'm sure that the rabbi is going to be able to remind me if I missed one. I have a few, she says. Okay, I'll wait for those if there's any other questions to come through. I shall have another drink. Are you going to post them back to me, Rabbi, or are you going to... Okay, can you tell about the skeletal structure again? Okay, so in basic terms, I'm not an expert osteologist, but the simplest way to explain it is that skeletal structure for humans varies between individuals on population levels, different ethnicities and so on. But in general terms, the distinguishing features that tell a male from a female will be primarily in the pelvis, the area to do with childbirth, and it's about ratios of height and width of the pelvis bones. And the pelvis bone is three bones that are interacting with each other. And for different skeletal structures, females can have very tall and narrow pelvises and still give birth. But on average, taller and narrower tends to equal male, and lower and wider bones female. And because even though we don't find pelvises intact in the archaeological record, they're the areas that are going to be very fragmented from some of the ratios of the relationship of the three main bones of the pelvis. We can usually tell whether someone is likely to be male or female. But as I'm trying to say, that's not a hard and fast rule. The other area where you can study is the skull. And obviously the skull and the musculature attachments of the skull to the neck tend to be bigger in men, and there's slightly different shape of the skull, the eye sockets, the zygomatic arches, the size of the mastoid process behind the ears, a whole series of features that you can tell whether this person is likely to be a male or female. So pelvis and skull mainly. There's other micro-morphological differences you can tell. There's other bone differences, but there's the general areas that osteologists will go to in a well-preserved skeleton. In 96-7% of the time, you can tell whether it's a male or female. The problem is that skeletons aren't always well preserved, and that some individuals are indeterminate, or only possibly or probably male or female. And there's also a series of biases depending on as I said, the work that person's done on their body and how their body's evolved, as to whether they will look more male or female according to... So you have to go by population that you're studying, not in terms of a universal, because, as I said, people in different populations with different activities will look more gracile or more robust. So there's a whole series of biases there. But those are in general terms. Can you recommend some trans archaeologists that people can look to and connect with? Not for this live purposes. I don't really want to name individuals in this context, if that's okay, Rabbi, because of I haven't got their permission to discuss their identities, and I'm not sure. I've lost track of who is willing to talk about this in a public way. I will share on the YouTube video the list of resources. Who some of the individuals who are writing that are trans. Other people I don't know, but they're writing on these issues. So if it's okay, I'd rather not, because I don't know how they self-identify. I know that, and part of this is the problem of the academic work. I don't look at their, at one level that's a good thing, but I don't look at their identity as the first point of call about what they're writing about, but also because I don't know when they want to be identified. There's some really interesting articles, but it's a bit, there's not, there are, I don't think many of the people who are actually writing about transgender archaeology necessarily identify as transgender. Some people do, but I don't know if that's public knowledge or so. If that's okay. Yes, I will put it on YouTube later, yes. How do we deconstruct our Western lens when it comes to First Nations anthropological studies? Big question, Bambi. And you know that I'm not sure how to answer this other than listening, learning, and working and collaborating. I don't work with First Nations. My archaeological focus is on Britain and Ireland and Scandinavia. Although I could, in my work, do more of that. I think what I suppose I'm doing is deconstructing the biases that affect the construction of the histories of the nations that did the colonising. And I think that is part of the way in which we do that work, is not simply how we work with the stories of First Nations, but how we decolonise the story of colonisation, if that makes sense. So that's another point. Yeah, okay, in schools. This is a really good point, Rabbi. Thank you. The trans identity in relation to archaeology being introduced in schools. So archaeology, this is a problem. Archaeology in UK schools is not officially part of the national curriculum. We're there under various other guises, including in geography classes, history classes, and there's been a new national curriculum for Wales, which I haven't even looked at, but I believe is even more transdisciplinary, but manages to move archaeology out. So the problem is we're not even there in schools as an official subject. There was a GCSE archaeology until a decade ago, and they scrubbed it. They then scrubbed the A-level archaeology. So the part of the problem is that archaeology is hardly being taught in schools at all. And then if we think about where people would learn about gender, non-binary gender, or gender variance in the past, let's use the term gender variance from Geller, where would people learn about that stuff from the archaeological record? I don't know. We can introduce it, but we need to have archaeology somewhere on our curricula in the UK before we can even begin to introduce it. And so I feel a lot of the human story is not being taught to our kids. They may get a bit about the Celts, the Romans, Normans, They may get a bit of horrible histories, but it's all kings and queens and bishops and emperors. It's not about anybody else, which is what archaeology tells us about. So I feel the whole of the discipline of archaeology is, we're so well established, and yet we're still on the back foot in terms of people will see documentaries about it, but they won't learn about it in schools. So the problem with it, I don't know how to say her name. Is it Ella? What is the evidence for gender-neutral identity in archaeology? Well, I have a problem with this term gender-neutral as used in archaeology because it's used in a range of horribly vague ways. Firstly, it's sort of an intersex identity or an intersex individuals or non-binary individuals. I think the problem is if we don't have... the problem with burial archaeology is because we tend to see gender associations of particular assemblages. That doesn't mean absence of evidence is evidence of absence. So just because someone doesn't have those objects in their grave doesn't mean they didn't have a gendered identity. If you believe such a naive thing, you'd be in a nonsense world where you think, well, everyone in the 5th, 6th, 7th century in England, southern East England, had a gendered identity. And then when Christianity came along, everyone lost their gender. All it means is that grave goods go out of fashion for a range of social, political, economic and religious reasons. So people are no longer being buried with objects as regularly. And so they're being buried with buckles, knives and a few other objects in the late 7th century. Doesn't mean people lost their gender. It's just a different tradition of burial in which gender expression is not as obvious to us as archaeologists, but it may be very obvious to the people doing the funeral. And the question is, do we call those people gender neutral because we can't see the gender expressions in the funerary archaeology? No. So I suppose the problem is a gender neutral identity may have been recognised, may have been understood, may have been respected, and we can sometimes discuss these issues when we find a mixture of different objects buried with the dead that usually are found in that society in different gender camps, in different gendered identities. But it's a really, I think we need to be very cautious about how we interpret that evidence. How do we combat bigotry in the field? Well, within the field itself, I have colleagues who have expressed very strong gender critical views to me. I have colleagues who express very strong support for the transgender community, if that's the right phrasing of it, or trans individuals. And I have tended to not say anything. Partly because, and I think that's one of the way we do it, is be clear that we don't tolerate intolerance and that we have views on these issues. But I must say that I'm admitting my own limitations, that it's a topic I've been, even though I have had trans, and partly because I have had trans students and because I do have trans students and I do have trans colleagues, I am very protective of their personal identities, to the point that I worry about when is the best time to discuss and address these issues, or can. And I particularly fear that, there is obviously the importance of raising awareness and speaking out, and people like to say this all the time: speak out, speak out, speak out. But there are times where this is not going to help that individual, and it could actually cause them harm and physical and emotional and psychological harm, to constantly bring that aspect of their identity into the broader discussion. And this is an ongoing issue for me. So I suppose being timid and saying nothing is not an answer, is not an excuse, and there's not an answer. I'm not justifying that. I'm saying, as a professional, as an academic, I have to be very careful about when, by shouting my mouth off about these issues, can help sometimes, and sometimes it can, without meaning to, I can cause deep harm by saying too much in the wrong way, in the wrong context. So I try to avoid that overt performativity, while equally being aware that these are people I can support quietly and behind the scenes. And so I think we combat it. There's no single strategy. I suppose what I'm getting at is there's no single strategy of combating bigotry in the field. But we have to have conversations where it's possible to have conversations. It's important to support and be directed by trans individuals when they tell us what they need and what they want and what we can do to support them. And certainly I was very aware of, I've had some students who very much benefited from the way I've approached things, but equally I don't always go, I wait for them to come to me about these issues, while trying to signal my allyship and in ways that are subtle but significant behind the scenes. And that may seem totally inadequate, but that's my attempts at trying to deal with this issue. But I think it's not going to go away. And given that almost everything is being turned into a culture war issue in the UK, and it's going the same way as America, these issues we're not going to be able to. It's just going to get more and more polemicised and antagonistic. So we just have to calmly, quietly, but robustly speak our voices on these issues, I feel. Oh, thank you. Haley without the H. Haley, thank you. Right, okay, sorry. I almost got there. I don't know, maybe I didn't. Sorry. Amateurs interested in archaeology, well, follow my Archaeodeath blog and on WordPress, and follow my TikTok. And also, there are some really great introductory books, to be honest, So, standard introductory basic books like Renfrew and Barn won't deal with much issues of what I've discussed today, but Archaeology and Theories, Methods and Practice by Colin Renfrew and Paul Barn, you can pick up sort of old editions of those for a couple of quid. They keep updating it for new archaeology students, but a good introductory textbook like that, or Kevin Green's Archaeology and Introduction, Green and more in the later versions. But if you get a book that's 10, 15 years old, frankly, it's good enough. They're good introductions. They're not, don't have to get the latest version. Brian Fagan is always wheeled out, but I don't deal with that's more American stuff for me. What is the host elevator speech answer to "you can always tell between male and female bones"? Well, you can't, Millie. That's the point. You can't always tell the difference. And those are not male and female gendered bones. Those are male and female sexed bones, and gender is not sex. That's my answer. Thank you for that feedback, Charlie. Thank you. I look like Robin Williams. Oh, that's a new one. I tend to be Alan Titchmarsh or Michael Sheen. I'll go with Michael Sheen. Thank you, Rebel Rabbi. Thank you, Michael Sheen. It is. Did you know that 40% of Gen Z are gay? Really? Okay. I didn't know that either. Wow. It's not enough, is it, really? I don't know. I think I've caught up. With everyone.
Oh, hi. Okay. I only did this because I had recorded all of the questions for you. And
I suddenly realised that's why you were
yeah.
Did I get through them all, or have you still got questions?
There's a couple actually that I was actually starting to type out the others. So, Professor, hold on, let me pull them up. So,
sorry, I took so long to notice that you had.
What efforts could be taken and put in place to balance the sensationalism of media when it comes to archaeological discoveries? This is a question from Millie.
Yeah, thanks, Millie. I think the sensationalism issue is one that is. I can hear a dog. Hello, dog.
I know,
very excited hound. I think the sensationalism issue is perhaps the easiest thing to combat. It's more the subtle stuff that's more, I think, insidious. But I think the sensationalism issue, I think, is addressed. Archaeologists tend to say, "I've done my research, I output it, and then whatever happens afterwards is not my problem." And I think archaeologists need to own up that even if they didn't create the problem, if the media sensationalize it, they should push themselves onto public platforms to actually respond. And this is where I think archaeologists can generally do some of their best work in countering misinformation through fact checking. And people like that, like ArchaeoWolf on this channel, he's not I love him to bits, but he does a very different style to me. I couldn't do his job, and I admire what he does. But he calls it out in acerbic but positive ways. I like it, but it's not for everyone. But that needs to be part of the mix of not just going, "Oh, it's out there now. Oh, the media, look what they've done. Oh, And as I said, with the BJ581 story, I'm of the opinion that they created the problem. And some people didn't see it as a problem, but I saw it as a problem in the way they spun that story, and they should have stayed with the narrative and countered some of the misinformation going on. Not with everything, but with some of it. That's my answer.
Okay, question 2, Professor. Sometimes the media sees themselves as the first draft when it comes to an account of history. How do we keep them in correction so that it isn't their record that becomes the mainstream idea?
Yeah. So I think I have some hope, outside of the fact that Twitter is unsearchable and may disappear anyway, that the problem is media stories don't disappear. They do lurk. You get, oh, it's just a flash in the pan, it'll go away. No, these ideas lurk. I'm still correcting misinformation from news stories a decade ago. Or even having other archaeologists say, oh yeah, isn't this the interpretation? No, everyone's countered that. And I think part of the thing is we should not talk to the media until we've done our analysis. And that's with the Czech example. They found something, and it went to the international media. And before they knew it, it was a story around the world with dumbass quotes. They probably didn't think through, probably their second language, English, and they said transsexual, and they probably didn't mean that. And before you know it, it's out there. So I think we need to think about when we're talking to the media, what we talk to the media, and we can. The curse is those stories are going to be around a long while, but the blessing is that our responses can be around a long while, and we can push back through our own channels. It may not reach the same audience, but at least people can search for it. We'll find it. So I think it's about refining search, working on Wikipedia and other publicly available platforms to point out the problems. The problem with I've tried working with Wikipedia, and it's a nightmare because it's only the editors are the same people sitting in the same cellars going through the same correction of things, and they only want to verify things that are already in the public domain. So if you actually want to provide fresh information, they'll say, no, this contradicts with the information already out there. Yes, because this is actually correct information, but they won't buy that. So it's really tough. But I feel you can't stop the sensationalism, but you can at least stay with the story and stay with it and try to address the misinformation.
If there was one takeaway from this particular live and lecture that you have done, what would be the most important takeaway for those who are listening and watching today?
That gender is historically situated, socially constructed, should not be confused with sex, and does not exist as a binary, but as a bimodal system. So there is gender variance in different societies, in all societies. We should neither say, therefore, that transgender identities have always been here, because that implies tacit universalism, nor should we say that transgender identities are only a phenomenon of our society, because that implies that there were no transgender people in the past. So those are extremes that I think we have to counter. We're looking for gender variation, and we can see it. And transgender, what we'd now call transgender, as part of past societies, but not in a way that we would understand in the same framework. And the archaeology can start to build a complex and rich story of the prehistory and early history of transgender identities, but it won't resemble what we think of today necessarily. Well, that wasn't an easy takeaway, but that's my kind of mix of key points that I wanted people to think about.
If you had to get students to want to pursue the academics of archaeology, what would be your sales pitch to get them involved in the idea of future archaeology?
Archaeology is the only subject that can tell the entirety of the human story. It's an interdisciplinary subject that touches on so many other disciplines. All other disciplines are basically subsets of archaeology in the humanities and social sciences, even though they pretend they're not. And it's blooming cool.
That's a lovely answer. I that would get me. I would study archaeology. So the last question that I have from the chat is, how can cisgendered archaeologists support their trans colleagues in pursuing the expansion of archaeological understanding of trans identity?
And I've already hinted at that, but I don't have a stock answer. So my answer is genuinely, I'm not sure. I mean, I've already made some points to that, showing, speaking out when required, supporting them professionally, and where required, and a lot of that will have to be behind the scenes and constructive, quiet work. But I think that's important work, and listening to their voices when they want to speak out on these issues, but not to reduce people to those. I mean, this is the other thing, isn't it, about anybody's personal identity? It's not, despite the fact that I think we're in a culture where we're supposed to declare identities. A lot of people don't want to and are not comfortable with that, or they feel they know the harm that will come to them if they do. And so it's about trying to respect their choices and to work within the bounds that they guide us. Now, that's my sense of things. I really think I'd like to hear transgender archaeologists tell me answers rather than me guessing. That's me guessing and my thoughts from the experience of working with some transgender individuals in a professional way. But I don't have an easy way of answering that, and I think it really is, perhaps I'd like to learn more about how we do it.
Okay, I do have a personal question for you about this subject. My question is, do you think that there will be a time in either the near future or further future where subjects like whether someone was trans or not trans in the archaeological record will stop mattering?
On one level, I think in academic terms, we're already there. I think some of the recent things I've been reading about, I think, are trying to make the point that, as I said, this shouldn't be our end goal of categorizing people based on their fragments of their remains or the traces they leave behind, and try to put them into boxes in the same way as, like, we have these, I don't know whether in seriousness or in jest, like how much are two fictional characters in a film gay, or are they just friends? Like we've had that banter about Elrond and Durin in the Rings of Power, or Frodo and Sam in the Lord of the Rings. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. And at one level, that's humorous and interesting and challenging of our heteronormative, and heterosexual sort of framings of characters. Another level, you think, that's part of the reading, that's part of the mix, of how we can think about these characters. And that's perhaps not the best analogy, but that's the first one that came to mind. Is that, yes, at one level it doesn't matter, because if we're looking at gender variance, we have to think about how these gender variables, are playing out in individual societies. And I think, but as long as there is bigotry, and as long as there is this continued, reduction of past societies, and rhetorical reduction of past societies to a male-female oppositional, binary, then we're going to have to tackle these issues. So one level, I think theoretically we're already in a world where archaeologists shouldn't be making this the primary focus of their work. But another level, there's a lot of work to be done when I see the biases and the bigotry play out. I don't know. That's not a very useful answer, is it? But that's the best I can come up with. Sorry.
No, I think that was a lovely answer. And I thank you for answering all of these questions from all these lovely people who spent so much time.
They have.
I noticed in all of these comments, your lecture was wonderful. I thank you for allowing me to help.
Thank you so much. You've made it so much easier. And thank you to all the other commenters. I haven't got to all of your I know there was some I skipped over because I wasn't quite sure how to answer, but I've tried to be honest, and I have limitations to what I know and what I'm trying to do here. But I thought it's been a real humbling privilege to get the feedback on the TikToks and then to get these kind and generous responses. So thank you all. And believe me now, it's almost like 2 hours. You guys are. If you were my students, you'd rock. I'd give you all first-class marks for simply staying awake through my wandering rambles. So thank you all so much for all your time and patience, and thank you, the wonderful Rebel Rabbi, for moderating it all. Thank you.
I'm gonna skip off now, and I'm on to tea now. So I've had my hang on, I've still got whiskey and tea. Well, I'll go. I finished the whiskey. I'm on the tea now. But it's late here. It's 2 a.m. So I'm gonna get on with some tea drinking and then maybe some sleep soon, eh? But thank you all. Thank you very much, and take care. Have a good night, and don't have nightmares about the archaeological past or those nasty future archaeologists. Okay, they're not real. They'll never happen. Okay, take care. Bye now.
Follow ArchaeoDeath on WordPress, or you'll never learn.